And on behalf of all of my colleagues, can I offer an extremely warm welcome to this evening's event celebrating the work of this year's winner of the Dalyell Prize. It's fitting that this celebration is taking place in this magnificent Playfair Library Hall. I think its soaring architecture is emblematic of the ambition of Enlightenment scholarship. The university was, of course, at the centre of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. And I think that the Enlightenment values of scientific rationalism, analytical rigour, and perfectibility of knowledge are values that we still aspire to today. The university feels that it's the start of a second Enlightenment. Now, Dalyell is a name, I'm sure, that needs no introduction to most of you here. He was an MP for 43 years, and he was also a rector of the university from 2003 to 2006. During his lifetime, he was an enthusiastic science communicator himself, and he wrote a weekly column for New Scientist magazine from 1967 to 2005. And in 2008, he endowed an annual prize at the university for excellence in engaging the public with science. And one of the conditions of the prize is that the winner will give a public lecture as part of the prize-giving ceremony. So that's where we are this evening. And it gives me very great pleasure to announce that the winner of the Dalyell Prize for 2017 and 18 is, of course, Dr. Niki Vermeulen. And she is joining a lineage of highly distinguished academics who have been past recipients of the prize, not least our late and very beloved colleague, Professor John Oberlander. Now, Dr. Vermeulen is a lecturer in the history and sociology of science in the School of Social and Political Studies in the university. As a marker of the esteem in which her scholarship is held, she was elected as a member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh Young Academy, and she is the author of over 30 landmark publications. It's a very wonderful career trajectory. Niki has been awarded the Dalyell Prize for her leadership of a team of scholars working to develop an app called Curious Edinburgh. This app comprises walking tours exploring the city of Edinburgh's rich heritage in the history of science, technology, and medicine. This evening, she will give a presentation about this app along with fellow collaborators Bill Jenkins, Hauke Weber, John Martin, Hannah Holtschneider, Gina Reddy, and Nicola Osborne. And Niki herself will introduce each of these speakers as they come up separately. After the presentation, there'll be some time for questions from the audience and for further discussion. And this will be followed by the actual presentation of the prize. So we'll do that at the end of proceedings. And then we'll have a wine reception at the front of the hall as you come in there, and that's how we will end. So, without further ado, can I invite Niki and her team to present this year's Dalyell lecture, Curious Edinburgh. Niki.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and welcome all to you. Thanks for being here. Last week I already got an email from a disappointed colleague who said that the event was sold out, so I was a bit surprised about that, to be honest. But it's wonderful that you're all here and also on a sunny day in Edinburgh, so I hope you had a lovely Sunday and that you also will enjoy this evening. So today I'm very happy to also be again at this event as part of the Science Festival, which is a wonderful event, and it's also the last day of the Science Festival, which is always a little bit sad, but I hope you enjoyed that festival too. And of course we're delighted with the occasion of having won the Dalyell Prize, because that's a great honor, obviously. So this evening we will tell you about our project, what Curious Edinburgh is, why we made it, and also a little bit about how we did it too. I'm saying we, as the development of Curious Edinburgh is very much a collaborative effort, and so we are giving a collective presentation today. We feature some of the people who contributed to this effort, and most importantly, Bill Jenkins, my colleague at Science, Technology and Innovation Studies and co-presenter who has invested a lot of time in this initiative, carefully composing and editing many of our walks. So together we will take you on a virtual tour through Edinburgh Scientific Path, starting with the place we are in today, and that is the Playfair Library. So if you haven't done so already, take a good look around, because it's obviously a magnificent building, as Leslie already pointed out as well. And as the name already says, this used to be a library. And this is how it used to be when, earlier on. The University of Edinburgh was first established actually on this site in the Charter of 1582, and thereby the town council gave this land where the building is on to the university, and the university opened in 1583. And then on this site there were lots of different kind of small buildings at first. And Edinburgh especially became known for its teaching in medical sciences, also because the Surgeons' Hall is quite close to this building. And the work on the building where we are in now, and this is another picture that shows that's the old college, started in 1789. And it was more or less completed in 1827, and that's a bit of a long time period, and you will hear why that time period was so long a little bit later. But the original design was done by Robert Adams, the architect, and he was a Scotsman who was also educated at the University of Edinburgh. And he then went to Italy to basically get his education in architecture. And of course, that's also where he got his classical inspiration from. So he brought this neoclassicism back to the UK, and then got the invite to make this building. And at that time, architects were not only like doing the outsides of the building, but also very much the interior design and also even the furniture. And so if you look around here, it's definitely kind of an inclusive way of designing. Unfortunately, Adam died in 1792, and the building was then redesigned and completed by William Henry Playfair, and that's of course where the Playfair Library name comes in. And he also had his education at the University of Edinburgh. He was part of the Playfair family that was quite influential. He also had two uncles that were working here at the university. And so he was the nephew of John Playfair, that some of you might know, because he was a professor of natural history here at the university. And he is also responsible for the Playfair collection, which is a collection of instruments that people in the university use and that you can now see in the National Museums of Scotland. And these are quite beautiful, all kind of like 18th century, 17th, 18th century instruments that he thought were important to preserve. So William Playfair, the architect, won actually the competition. There was a competition to get on with the work on the building after the death of the architect, and also some wars that were going on. And he won that competition. I think there were 7 other competitors. And that was a very good start of his career. As you see, he also very much had this neoclassical style. And after that, he was invited to make quite a lot of different buildings around Edinburgh as well. You might know the National Gallery and the Royal Academy, also next to each other on the Mount, that are also built by him. And also the unfinished copy of the Parthenon on Calton Hill is also done by him. And so you see all these columns, so it's very much kind of going back to the classics. So this library opened in 1827. It was the last part of the building to be completed together with the dome. That also came even later. And interestingly, after the death of Playfair, he donated all the architectural drawings that he made were donated to the same university library, and they're still there, and there's about 5,000 of them. So that's quite nice. If you want to have a look at that, you can, because I guess they will be open. So the university library stayed in this place till 1967, and then it moved to George Square. You might know the building, which is quite newer. It's also much larger, so that says something about the growth of the collection of the library. And so now the library is more used for events like this and other types of lectures. This building is also playing a very important role in the start of Curious Edinburgh. And it's one of the first stops on the tour that John Henry, the now retired professor of science history, who you can see here on this picture, was always giving every year. So he led the new colleagues that were joining our group, Science, Technology and Innovation Studies, and also the postgraduate students. When we arrived at the beginning of the year, he would tour us around the city of Edinburgh and show all the important places where connected to important scientific events. So when I arrived in Edinburgh in 2014, that was actually one of the first things I did. And that was such a wonderful tour because it showed me Edinburgh in a completely different way. And already then I was thinking, okay, this would be really lovely if more people would actually be able to go to this tour. Now, of course, we have quite a lot of students that we're teaching in our group. It's about 500 that are doing history of science or history of medicine. So this is quite a huge amount. And then also thinking about different colleagues, people working at the university, and also members of the public that would be interested in this. I thought, okay, how to do that? Then, of course, one option would be for John to become a full-time tour guide. But as he was more looking forward to a more relaxed retirement, I thought, well, that's not the solution. So then we thought, okay, why don't we make an app out of this? And that was quite a simple idea in my mind. But then, of course, it turned out to be much more complicated to actually make this happen. But luckily, we succeeded with that. So what we did is we started quite low tech. That means that the next year we thought, okay, we have to record what John Henry is saying. So Matthias, a PhD student of mine, was actually willing and handy enough to take a camera. So what we did is we basically went on the tour with John again, and we asked if it would be okay if we made a videotape out of that. And that is actually also the picture that you see. And unfortunately, John couldn't be here today because he had an examination, or he's taking off a PhD examination in London tomorrow. So he had to excuse him, but we thought it would be nice if he's there anyways. So you will see a little bit of John Henry's tour, and he's going to tell you a bit more about this building and the start of the university.
And so in 1580, the Towns College decided that they would give over this land and found the town, so-called Towns College, the university. And there were sort of various buildings scattered about here, and also extending into what's now Chambers Street. So this was the university precinct, as it were. This building started to be built in 1790 or 1789. And was only completed because there were, lots of trouble with the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars and so on. So it held up, people ran out of money. So this building was only finished in 1827, just as Darwin was here, or just as Darwin was about to leave, in fact, except for the dome, which was added in 1880. So that's about 60-odd years later. And believe it or not, when the medical school started here in 1720, before this building, I think there was a building in that corner which was where the medical teaching took place. First of all, the first professor of medicine here at that's not true. There were earlier professors who never gave any lectures, who never did anything. But the first one, the man, Alexander Munro Primus, was the first one who started up the medical school and made it such a success. So he was teaching, first of all, he was teaching down in the College of Surgeons, where we started out from. He was teaching there, even though he had a university appointment, but it just sort of seemed to make more sense for him to be down there. And even then, in the 1720s, long before, a century before Burke and Hare came along, there were always riots and objections when medical people took bodies down from the gallows and brought them to the medical school for dissection. So there were lots of riots and things like this. And the medical school, the Old Surgeons' Hall was easy to get at, for these people, so they could mob it. And Alexander Munro asked for permission to move into the university precinct up here, into this building here. So that happened in 1725 when he moved up here. And he did that because it was safer, because there was only one entrance to the university in those days. So you couldn't come in the way we've just come in, because Southbridge wasn't there, okay? So down there was a drop, yeah? And in fact, you can now go on some of these ghost tours that will take you into the buildings underneath here. So you couldn't get up onto the university from here, you had to get in. We'll go past the entrance, the only entrance to the university later on in the tour. So once Munro was up here, he could bring his bodies up here and dissect them, and the townsfolk couldn't get through the gate, the single entrance into the university, and so he was much safer. And so from then on, the medical school flourished. The reasons why the medical school here flourished, by the way, as well as a number of reasons. First of all, lectures were given in English as opposed to Latin, which is popular with, well, certainly popular with English-speaking people. So a lot of Americans came and a lot of Australians came here. And the other thing was that you didn't have to do any religious oaths. You know, if you wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you had to swear by the oaths of the Anglican Church. If you weren't an Anglican, you didn't want to do that, so you'd come to Edinburgh. And the other thing was that you didn't have to matriculate here, so some people did matriculate to do a full degree, but other people just came along to do, you know, lectures as they felt like it and pay at the door to do lectures. And the reason why that was set up was because, and this was the most brilliant aspect, the town council decided, it was their college, the town's college, and they decided they would only give the professors a very tiny salary. So Alexander Munro, who sort of really got things going, was only paid £15 a year. So remember, I told you that Burke and Hare got 14 guineas for a body, right? So the professor's only paid £15 for a year, but he's allowed to charge people to come in at the door to his lectures. And so it was in his own interest to be an absolutely brilliant lecturer, so that people would pay to come in and see him. And, you know, he used to have 300 students and sometimes had to do his lectures 2 or 3 times in a day, because he had, you know, sort of 900 students effectively, you know, 300 each time paying, you know, so he could make a lot of money.
Yeah, so that was John, and he very much made the beginning of this this tour. And so I'm happy that you were all able to see him, and you can see more of him and his things on the tour if you download the app. So now I have to make this bigger again. Yeah, so what we did is that that should be appearing, is we used his tour for the basis of this first kind of general science tour. Bill edited. You can see that there's actually some of the movies that we clipped from this kind of longer movie from John, and we put this all together. But then, of course, we needed to also put this on a phone app, and that's actually where Edina and Nicola Osborne come in, and her team, who actually helped us to translate this. And so this is actually the result of it. On the left, you can see kind of the route on the map with all the different stops of this science tour. And then on the right, you have a list with all the different buildings, and the app works like that, that if you click on one of the numbers, or either on the map or in the list, that you will actually see something more. And this is, for instance, this one, Peter Higgs plaque. You can see that in Roxbury Street. And that tells then the story of Peter Higgs, who worked as a lecturer in the Tate Institute of Mathematical Physics in Edinburgh, when he came up with what is now called the Higgs boson, this subatomic particle. And he actually was writing these papers there in 1964, and only in 2012 they were actually able to experimentally trace this particle, or this subatomic particle, I have to say, at CERN in Geneva. They even built a whole new Large Hadron Collider there, or they had to build that before they were actually able to trace it. And he got in 2013 the Nobel Prize for this. And so this building is quite close. If you just, you can find where that was. So when we were working on this first kind of science tour, we also discovered that John only covered a really small part of the many, many places that Edinburgh has that are connected to the history of science, technology and medicine. And so we started to think about different places that we wanted to include as well. But then having a virtual walking tours actually do have a limit, because we learned that about 20 to 25 stops on a tour is kind of a little bit the max. Not only because if you wanted to walk it, it's quite a long time already, and also, of course, we have to make sure that it all fits on a phone. So that's why we started to think, well, maybe we should actually make different tours and then all having a different theme. So after the general science tour, we made one on the history of physics, and then afterwards we thought the history of geology would be a good one. And the reason why that would be a good one is that Bill actually did his PhD on the history of geology in Edinburgh, or at least it was very closely connected to that. So Bill basically designed the one on the history of geology, and we'll also talk about this tour a little bit.
Well, it was no coincidence that when we were looking at the first few tours to make for the history of science, technology, medicine in Edinburgh, the history of geology was very high up in that list, because the subject has a very close connection with the city. And indeed, the earth scientists have a long and distinguished history here. In this picture, you'll see one reason why. The city has a very dramatic topography, probably one of the most dramatic topographies of any city in the world. The city itself is built on a series of extinct volcanoes, as I'm sure most of you know. And between these volcanoes have been carved ravines and valleys by the glaciers of the last ice age. So underlying this topography is this very interesting geology. And the picture in the middle here shows one element of that geology. It's, I'm sure you all recognize, Salisbury Crags. And the particular sites that we're looking at here is known as Hutton's section because of its association with the gentleman on the left here, James Hutton, in a fantastic caricature by John Kay, who produced caricatures of many of the key figures of the 18th century in Edinburgh. And there he is with his geological hammer and some rocks hammering away. Hutton is a figure who appears many times in our various tours because he played many roles. But essentially, he's often described as the father of modern geology. Personally, I'm not very keen on assigning patrimony of an entire scientific discipline to one individual, but he's often described in that way. And certainly he played a very key role. And he believed essentially that the history of the Earth was a history of a series of uplift and erosion events, which were cyclical. So essentially the history of the Earth was cyclical and, to all intents and purposes, eternal. However, his theory wasn't the only game in town. The other man you see here on the right-hand side is a man called Robert Jameson. Now, Jameson's a little bit later than Hutton. They were contemporaries, but Hutton died in 1797. Jameson became professor of natural history here in Edinburgh in 1804, so a little bit later. And he was the leading figure in the other school that dominated geology at the time, the Wernerians. He was a follower of Abraham Gottlob Werner, the great German mineralogist. And he believed, quite conversely to the views of Hutton, that the history of the Earth wasn't a cyclical history. It was actually directional. Time had an arrow, if you like, and the Earth had started out as very hot and covered in a universal ocean and gradually cooled, and that ocean receded. So essentially the past was different from the present, and the future will be different again. So in the words of Stephen Jay Gould, the great and much lamented evolutionary biologist and historian of science as well, Hutton believed that the history of the Earth was a series of cycles, whereas Jameson believed that it could be represented by an arrow, that there was a directional change going on there. And both of these figures are covered in our talk, and here's actually the walk as it appears on the app. As you can see, all the different stops there. We've also showing you one of the stops in a bit more detail. On the right-hand side, we have, in fact, the site of Hutton's house. Now, sadly, Hutton's house was demolished and is no longer actually visible, but on its site, there is now a small garden, the Hutton Memorial Garden. And there's a plaque there, and there are also some pieces of rock from various sites that were significant in his work, from Glen Tilt, for example, also from Sicker Point, down in the Borders. So it's quite an interesting site if you're interested in the history of geology. It's quite hard to find, though. It's tucked away behind a multi-storey car park just off Holyrood Road. So we're hoping this app will make it a little easier for people to track it down. I must admit I had some trouble the first time I tried to find it. And from there you would, if it weren't for some trees, but in Hutton's day, you would have got a fantastic view over to Salisbury Crags and some of the sites that Hutton, some of his haunts where he picked up ideas for his theories. Now I'm just going to look at another one of our stops from this tour in a little more detail. Historians and geologists these days often disagree. They might say harsh words about each other in journal articles, for example, but they seldom actually come to blows over their theories. This wasn't necessarily true in the early 19th century, and this site here is connected to one of these conflicts. It's actually the site of the old Theatre Royal in Edinburgh. So the connection with geology might not seem immediately obvious. It's roughly where the end of North Bridge is now, just opposite where the Balmoral Hotel now stands. But in those days, it was actually the site of a square called Shakespeare Square. Good name for a square that had a theatre on it. And this picture here shows the theatre. And in 1812, one of James Hutton's most vociferous fans, a man called George Mackenzie, who was a significant geologist in his own right, put on a play that he'd written himself. He'd gone on a tour of Iceland, and he'd been very impressed there by some of the sagas that he came across while he was there. And when he came back, he wrote a play based on one of these sagas called Helga or the Rival Minstrels. Obviously, while he was there, he spent a lot of time looking at volcanoes. Volcanoes play a big part in Hutton's theories. But I'd say he was also a man with literary interest too. So when he came back, he wrote this play, and it was to be put on at the Theatre Royal in 1812. Unfortunately, word got out to the rival camp of geologists, the Wernerian geologists, Robert Jameson's disciples. And possibly Jameson might have played some role in this. He might have had a word with some of his students, perhaps. But on the opening night of the play, the audience was packed with Wernerian geologists who caused effectively a riot, shouted, threw things at the actors, and the play closed after the first night and never reopened. Very sad. But again, showing that geology can arouse quite strong feelings at times, certainly in the early 19th century. I'm also going to say a few words about one of our other tours. This one was actually produced with a great deal of help from Alistair MacLean, who's a professional tour guide who gave us a lot of assistance in putting this one together. Now, you've heard a little bit about the Scottish Enlightenment already, very much based in Edinburgh, although I have to say, being from the West Coast myself, Glasgow also played a significant role. I should just sort of sneak that in there. But many of these figures actually taught at Glasgow University as well. What we have is, you'll recognise some of them, I'm sure, just going from top left, sort of clockwise. We have Adam Smith, the great economist, one of the fathers of political economy, Joseph Black, the chemist. We then have Adam Ferguson, one of the founders of sociology and modern social sciences. We then have William Smellie, perhaps less well known to you, but he was the first editor of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. He was also the publisher-in-chief, effectively, to some of these other figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, and was a significant natural historian in his own right, too. Then we have James Hutton, and finally, in the rather natty red jacket, we have David Hume. So this tour tells us a little bit more about these figures, but also it tells us a little bit about the connections between them, because one of the key things to remember about the Scottish Enlightenment was to what extent these people actually knew each other and socialized together. They didn't just read each other's books, they actually kind of got together and discussed the latest ideas in philosophy and science with each other. And in our tour, we look a little bit at one of the places where this actually happened, one of these sites of socialization, if you like. That was a place called the Oyster Club, which we see here in this image. Now, this is just off the Cowgate, so not tremendously far from here. It's now a venue for weddings and that sort of thing, so it's not actually open to the public, unfortunately. But in Hutton's day, in James Hutton's day, at the height of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 1770s, this was the venue for the Oyster Club, as it was known. And in fact, Hutton was one of the founders of this club, but also other founders include Adam Smith and Joseph Black. So you've got an economist, a geologist, and a chemist all getting together and founding a club where they can meet and discuss ideas, which just shows you that the barriers between disciplines that we now are familiar with didn't really exist in these times. There was a lot of interchange of ideas. So this club was somewhere that people could not just discuss ideas, but they could have a drink, They could eat oysters, as the name would suggest. And it became a venue which actually attracted people from all over the world too, when they were visiting in Edinburgh. For example, Benjamin Franklin dined there. He was a guest of the Oyster Club. Barthélemy Fougès de Saint-Fond from Paris came over as well, and James Watt spent lots of time in Edinburgh, obviously, but came from Glasgow originally. So it was a major venue for scientists internationally who could meet and socialise and talk about the latest ideas. So that gives you a little flavour of the Scottish Enlightenment tour. So I'll hand you back over now to Niki to talk a little bit about the history of medicine.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for that. So we also have a history of medicine and a history of genetics and biotech tour. So as you can see here, Dolly the sheep, who is in the National Museum of Scotland, just in the back. And so we worked together with Claire Button from the university collections to make a tour on biotech. And the other one on medicine, yeah, you can see here the surgeon's halls and then the famous anatomist Robert Knox. This tour is also actually featuring the Edinburgh 7. That's the 7 first female medical students that put up a fight to actually be able to study and complete their degrees in Edinburgh in 1869. They started with that, so that was that's one of my favorite stops in that tour. And another one from the history of medicine that I think is worth a visit is actually the botanic cottage that you can find in the Botanic Gardens. Originally, it wasn't there. The Botanic Gardens have had 3 different places in Edinburgh. First, where the station is now, then on top of Leith Walk, and then actually in the Botanic Gardens where they are now in Inverleith. And they've replaced this cottage, and you can actually see it if it's not full with people that have workshops and stuff. And if you go upstairs, you can actually see the classroom where John Hope, the botanist, was teaching medical students. And what is very nice is that they've also recreated like the medical garden around it, so you can still see all the plants and things that that used to be there around as well. So this is actually giving you an overview of all the different tours that we've made so far. You see the history of science, technology, and medicine, so the general one that John Henry started with, the history of geology one, the history of physics, history of medicine, history of genetics and biotechnology, the Scottish Enlightenment, and 2 new ones that we will tell a little bit more about later on, the Jewish history and the brewing history. But before that, we thought this is obviously about a phone app and a website too. So if you don't have a phone, you can go to the website. But in any case, if you do have a phone, this is one of the lectures where you're allowed to play around with it. So if you have one, download the app, and yeah, you can actually follow live with the stops that we're showing. We couldn't have done this without the help of Edina and Nicola Osborne, and so she's going to tell you a little bit about the technical story behind the app. So thanks for that.
Yes, I'm not going to get super technical, but I will give thanks to my software engineering colleagues, Ben Butchart, Jose Claret Perez, and George Hamilton, who did the kind of coding part of this. I will tell you how they did it, though. So we wanted to make an app that was expandable to all of these many extra tours that Niki and Bill wanted to put together, and actually to allow them to make little updates and changes as well, potentially. Because usually when you build a mobile phone app, stuff is kind of hard-coded in, so that can mean real effort when you want to actually change something, or if you suddenly decide that your history of science tour stop is also really relevant for the history of chemistry tour, or you want to also mention it in another tour. So we thought, what's the best kind of way of having an editing screen for this? And we decided that WordPress, which some of you in the audience might have used before, I'm going to look for nods. A few. So WordPress, which allows you to write blog posts. It's very simple. It's a bit like editing something in Word. Only ours is a bit pimped. It's got some extra stuff added into it. So this is the editing screen for writing a new tour stop. And if you scroll down the screen, you'll find a whole bunch of extra settings which will ask you for things like the geolocation. So we take a latitude and a longitude, and that lets us put those map pins on the map. We ask for which tour it's going to be in and what number that is. And essentially, it makes it just a way of filling in a form to create each tour stop. And then little bits of magic happen. So WordPress has a thing called an application programming interface. This is the nerdiest thing I will say, I promise. And that essentially is like a recipe for asking for bits of information. So we use that to sort of say, okay, we want to know everything that's on the Geology Tour, and we want to know which number they are, and then we use that to create the map of those pins and a listing of the tour stops, as you've seen various screenshots of. So That bit's very nice and neat. And we also have some cleverer stuff going on as well. So whenever we add a new tour, we add a new bit of information to the About page. So if you go to the website and look at the About page, there's a list of tours. And actually, we do some machine reading of that page. So it automatically updates when a new tour is added, which is rather natty. So it's quite simple, but quite clever. And it's all built on open source software. So it uses React Native, which you probably haven't ever heard of, but you will have heard of Facebook and their apps. And the way that they make their app work on phones and devices across the world is with an open source tool called React Native. So we use that to actually build the app. And we use WordPress for the back end, and we use OpenStreetMap. So Edinburgh, you may not know, has a whole legion of secret mappers who run around crowdsourcing information on what is where in the city. So if you want to know where all of the rubbish bins are, or all of the post boxes, detail of that level, like the Ordnance Survey has nothing on the volunteers of Edinburgh, then go and have a look at OpenStreetMap. Not all cities are equally well crowdsourced, I have to say. Edinburgh is exceptional. But that's an open source mapping as well. So it's free to use, it's shareable, it's a really nice thing to use. If any of you are really into the code, my colleagues have put it on GitHub. You can go and have a look at it. You can see our outstanding issues and report new issues. If you want to be really participative and tell us what we need to fix in the app, you can go on there as well.
Thank you very much for this technical explanations. So we now wanted to move towards the newest, the novel walks and tours and the tours in the making that we've added more recently, and also the ones that are actually not yet online. So when we were making these tours on the development of science, technology and medicine, we also discovered, of course, that the app would have more possibilities in terms of kind of showcasing local communities and what the buildings are there, and also international connections. And also it turned out that people started to find our app and were asking, can we not just add a tour to your app? So that was wonderful. So we thought this new part we would like to do in collaboration with the people that have been making those tours. So to start with, we have actually the history of brewing tour already online, and also the history of Jewish communities in Edinburgh. And then we will have two that are in the making, which is one on the history of connections between Edinburgh and India, and also one on industrial heritage in Granton. So we will be starting with the brewing one, and actually the brewing tour was something that we were thinking of quite early in the process, that this would be excellent because it obviously involves a lot of science. Edinburgh has been one of the brewing capitals, I think, with lots of breweries, and we thought that would also probably be a tour that attracts quite a lot of people towards the app. So we thought that would be nice, and then we actually met John Martin, which was even better, because he's working for the Scottish Brewing Archive Association, and this is a wonderful association that actually brought together all the archives of the breweries that were bought up by the larger companies. So they have all the material, the historical material of breweries in Edinburgh and in Scotland, actually largely also in Glasgow. And so John was already making tours for people, showing them around Edinburgh and the breweries. So he is here today, and he will tell you a little bit more about the tour that we composed with him and the archive.
Thanks, Niki. Well, great attendance here tonight, so thanks very much for coming. As Niki mentioned, I represent the Scottish Brewing Archive Association, and primarily we promote the history of brewing in Scotland, and primarily Edinburgh. Edinburgh did have, at one time, over 40 breweries. Yeah, 40 breweries, that seems amazing. It was a huge industry. But if you go to any of the museums in Edinburgh, there is very little that tells you anything about it. So that's one good reason why this app that was created tells you a little more, not only of the history of brewing, but also the history of brewing in Scotland. So the archive started, it was founded by Heriot-Watt University and by Sir Geoff Palmer in particular. And Geoff, he was the very first black professor in Scotland, but he was also an authority on grain. And it was through a chance meeting that he actually founded the actual archive. Albeit it was started by Heriot-Watt, when they moved out to Riccarton, they felt it wasn't the right thing for them to continue because the actual archive had grown to such an extent, and it was transferred through to Glasgow University, where it currently is. The archive started in 1981, but it's been in Glasgow University for the last 20 years. And you can actually, by appointment, go and visit and learn quite a lot about the actual history of brewing. Many of the brewing companies are represented there. I first met Niki and Bill about 2 years ago, and that was when they attended one of my brewing walking tours in the Canongate. And the Canongate did have, either on the Canongate or nearby, about 20 breweries. So it's roughly about half the number of breweries in Edinburgh at one time. So that's where we actually met, and from that, the app is now come into being, so which is really good. I could go on to such an extent, but I was only told 5 minutes. So if you want to know more about it, please look at the app, or you can actually speak to me afterwards, and I can arrange a quick tour for you as well. However, I've picked out just one thing that might whet your appetite, and that is the Calton Hill Brewery. It's actually on Calton Road. However, the brewery at that time, that's going back to the 1830s, it was actually on the north back of the Canongate. It's now called Calton Road. And the Calton Hill Brewery, its claim to fame is it was the very first place in the UK to brew lager, and that was in 1835. So Edinburgh were the first to brew lager, not only in Scotland, but in the UK. I won't say any more, apart from to encourage you to go to the app and learn more about it. You'll learn more about the science connections with brewing, how that came about, and many other things that has a tie-in with much of Scotland's history. So I'll stop there and pass on back to Niki again. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, so John's tours are obviously, I mean, it's nice to see them in the app, but if you have a chance, do it live, because that's always slightly better still, I have to say. And his tours always end with a nice pub visit, which is only fitting when it comes to beer. In this case, you have to wait a little bit longer, but they did promise me drink afterwards, so that will be there. So the other tour, so you can see indeed already on the app, the other tour that is already visible on the app is Curious Edinburgh on food. This is made by Hannah Holtsneider and the Jewish Literary Society, and so they have put together this walking tour and already appeared on BBC Radio as well. So it's famous, and so she will be telling you a little bit more on the Jewish Edinburgh.
Thank you very much, Niki. I'm really feeling very privileged to be here and to be able to present a little bit about the tour. In 2012, I, with colleagues, pioneered an exhibition on Jewish history in Edinburgh, which is now visible in the synagogue, and for a long time it was standing in New College on the Mound. And a couple of years later, in 2015, I became PI on an AHRC project to look at Jewish migration into Scotland. And one of the things I was looking at is how the Jewish community formed from about the early 18th century onwards, but my focus of research is really the early 20th century. But one of the things that transpired in this research was that it was really quite interesting to make something happen or make something visible in Edinburgh about Jewish history. And through Anne-Sophie Legrand of ERI, she put me in touch with Niki, and that was very helpful. And I had a couple of meetings with Niki and Bill, and we got talking about the possibility of a humanities tour that is piggybacking on the social science and on the science history tours. Interestingly, there are quite a number of overlaps. So Calton Hill has already been mentioned, and I present one of the stops of the tour in Calton Hill. But first of all, I'm going to give you a little insight into what the Jewish History Tour covers. Right, these are our 12 stops on the tour. So the walking tour really takes you on a journey across about 200 years. The tour begins on the High Street, partly because we're thinking we need to introduce people to Edinburgh's geography as well, as to where are we located, and it tells also a little bit about the history of the city, and then tries to locate the Jewish residents of Scotland's capital within the larger history of Edinburgh. Edinburgh was home to is home to the very first Jewish community in Scotland, so it's a nice starting point for any further exploration of Jewish history. And of course, Glasgow has the larger community very quickly. In the 19th century, the community in Glasgow grew much faster. The tour starts in the Old Town, in the medieval city, with its narrow alleys known as closes, and also the first residences of Jewish residents in Edinburgh were on the High Street. So we can go to Bishop's Close as the very first stop, roughly positioned across from the Radisson Blu Hotel. And we can find already in 1817 about 20 families in the city, one of which is living in Bishop's Close. By 1841, we've got about 50 Jewish households in Edinburgh. However, only 8 of those 50 households is living in the new town. So it's quite a large social divide. Only about 8 families made it into the more affluent parts. The others settled in the Old Town or in St. Leonard's. And the tour really is a South Side tour. You will find on this tour a number of stops that connect you with, for example, Peter Higgs, where Peter Higgs was writing his papers. He was right next door to a surgery run by the Lippitz brothers, who were not only looking after university staff, but also very early advocates of the NHS, looking after a very impoverished population in the South Side. And Peter Higgs, in fact, was one of their patients. The stop I'm going to present is the second stop on the tour, which has got a nice overlap with the history of science aspects. So we go back in time before the first synagogue was founded, when we can identify, in the late 18th century, we can identify about 18 Jews in the register of aliens and foreigners that people were obliged to complete in 1794. Among those was a man called Haman Lyon. He and his wife lived in the Canongate, nice connection with the brewery tour. And a number of others lived further down the high street as well. Haman Lyon is famous for 2 reasons. The first one is his book of over 400 pages on chiropody, which you can find in the National Library of Scotland if you want to see the original copy. Secondly, he's famous for his purchase in 1794 from the City Council of a burial plot on Carlton Hill, which is right underneath the Royal Observatory. So you can't actually see the burial chamber, although there are some excavations that have taken place and some thermal imaging has been done, so you can see a survey of the actual plot and you can't see it. So we've chosen to position people to look across to Carlton Hill. It's significant because it shows once again that Scotland was a place that was very favourably disposed towards Jews. Jews could buy any land they wanted and they could bury wherever they wanted. The first Jewish cemetery, which was on the very first slide you saw, is in Sheen's House Place, deep down in the south side in Newington, just across from the meadows, which obviously in the early 19th century was a loch, helpful for all the breweries. So the tour really takes you on various stops about immigration history and about the establishment of the Jewish community in the city. It ends at the synagogue in Salisbury Road, where you can also see the previous exhibition from 2012. I think that's about all I have to say, and I encourage you to look at the tour online.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we went on that at one Sunday, I think it was, and ended up in the synagogue too, which is a beautiful building. So yeah, it's an enjoyable tour. Well, now we're getting to the tours that are actually not viewable online yet, so that's really a preview. One that is almost done, and so it's going to be live very soon, is a tour on the connections between India and Edinburgh. It's made by the India Institute, Roger Jeffrey, and Wiebe Hauke, and Hauke Wiebe, sorry, and he's actually going to present this India tour today. He's not only a scholar, but he's also a professional travel guide. So we have 2 travel guides in the room today. So yeah, please do get.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Niki. Yes, links between Edinburgh and India. They are significant and they are significantly unknown as far as I noticed. I mean, just walking up from the courtyard to where you're sitting now, how many links did you spot between Edinburgh and India? 5. I've spotted at least 5. Abdul Kalam, former president, got an honorary degree. Shah Rukh Khan, Bollywood star, quite famous. We very recently got an honorary degree. Then if you walk towards the stairs, there's a very noticeably Parsi-looking gentleman, half hidden behind a lamp before you go up the stairs, Kawasji Jahangir, who donated money to the university from Bombay. Then if you go further up, there's a lady behind you looking down on you, which is Margaret Bruce, very Scottish name, but her mother was Indian. She herself was born in India. She donated lots of money again to the university. She was one of the richest Scottish Indian women. And then as you go in, there's Sir William Muir, who was for a long time principal in the late 19th century here at the university, and who was for a long time before that in what's now Uttar Pradesh, a colonial administrator. Now, because of that, we set up this project, which is about much more than just the history of the Indian community in Edinburgh. It's about all the India links, of which we managed to gather in the last 10 years about 20,000, of which Niki allowed us very gracefully to include 30 in this app. We had to reduce ourselves as well. We've got 2 walks. We've got one in the old town and one in the new town. And we, a bit like a banyan tree, we are spreading our tentacles into other projects, and we've got a book coming up in 2019 in the Social Science Press in New Delhi. We've got an oral history project going on, interviewing people who have got links with South Asia, and we've got a website as well, which is being worked on, which the app, which is yet another tentacle of our project, will link to. So if you see something on the app, there will be very often something with a lot more detail in that website coming on. Now, as an example how that philosophically works, we've chosen our least promising site. You stand here, that's basically Kingstay Road, Lothian Road. You can see the buses rolling right, and you can see the large building of the Caledonian Hotel. And no doubt the Caledonian Hotel will have had Indian guests. In fact, it's got an Indian owner at the moment. But that's not what we're looking at. What we're trying to point you at is these buildings. The church, you probably know where it is. It's in Stockbridge. Originally, it stood where it's standing now. The site has significantly changed. The more interesting thing is the building on the left, which is the SNMA, the Scottish Naval and Military Academy. You can see it on old maps. It stood on the corner of Lothian Road and St Cuthbert's Lane. St Cuthbert's Lane is also gone. The building which replaced St George's Church and the Naval Military Academy is also gone, now replaced by the Caledonian Hotel. So there's really absolutely nothing left there anymore if you go there. But there's an awful lot of story behind it. The Scottish Naval and Military Academy, as you can see, there's a nice ornate symbol there they had for their orders and decorations they gave out. Was a privately run academy. It wasn't run by the army, it wasn't run by the East India Company. It was run by people who had retired from military service, who imparted their knowledge for training. And we estimate that between about 1,300 and 2,000 young men were educated there for the Navy, for the Army, but also significantly for our project, for the East India Company services. Building, that's what it looked like, that's all we know from the building. We found a couple of documents on the academy in the National Library, for instance, where we've noticed that there was a significant, linking to the History of Science project, quite a significant point of education was made towards mathematics, things like that, for artillery, for fortification building, things like that. Captain John Orr, he was the principal for a long time. He himself famous for links to the Battle of Waterloo, but 2 of his sons, for instance, served in India. We've got him, Sir Robert Cadell, General Sir Robert Cadell. He was one of those modern major generals which we've heard about in the Gilbert and Sullivan song, which were scientifically educated, partly by the Scottish Naval Military Academy in things like mathematics, in science. For ballistics, he was an artilleryman. Significant links to India here. He served for a long time in southern India. He served during the Indian uprising. Later on, he retired to become a member of the Tranent School Board. Education was very important for him. If you look more for things about the academy, for instance, you won't find it on the site. Like I say, there's nothing there on the site. But if you go up in the castle, they've got a nice display cabinet of, for instance, this nice Sword of Honor which for gentlemanly conduct, given for Patrick Lindsay, one of the students. You find a number of decorations, nice bit of crockery. They had their own club as well for their former pupils, for the former cadets. We find, for instance, very interesting, a medal for French and Hindustani awarded to Robert Pope, which means they didn't just teach military sciences, they didn't just teach warcraft, they also taught languages. And indeed, they had a very distinguished teacher, James Robert Ballantyne, who, as it says here in the advertising, is teacher for Persian, for Hindustani, and for Arabic. So they had their own teacher for these subjects because they expected a lot of their cadets would go out to India. And in those days in India, you could not rely on anybody speaking English. You had to learn the language. And if you commanded large numbers of soldiers, you had to speak Hindustani. And he was their teacher. And he wasn't just a old retired soldier or anything like this. He was quite a significant academic on the subject. While he was teacher, in the 10 years he was teacher at Lothian Road, he published a Maratha grammar, books on Persian calligraphy, catechism on Sanskrit grammar, an Oriental interpreter. This is just the easiest first pages of the primer for Hindustani. Later on, it gets into a lot more philosophical and poetical language. And so successful indeed was he that he got the Indologist equivalent of taking colds to Newcastle. He was taken to Benares, to Varanasi, to teach Sanskrit there at the college, and quite successfully indeed so. So for an Edinburgh man from Lothian Road to go out there and teach Sanskrit to the Indians, it's not a bad start, I would say. Quite a lot of back history for the story, but as I said, if you just stood at that corner, you could stare at that large red sandstone cliff of the Caledonian Hotel forever, and you wouldn't know. You would simply not know. The only reason you would know is because of Niki and Bill and their wonderful app, Curious Edinburgh, which we are allowed to join and which will soon go live with the India and Edinburgh links.
Thank you very much. And of course, we will all let you know when this tour is going to get live. So the final tour that we're actually going to talk about today is Granton Hub. This is also a tour in the making. And Gina Reddy is part of the Granton Hub, I would say, and she's going to present this tour to you. So thanks very much, Gina.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks very much to Niki, of course, and to Bill for inviting me tonight, and also for inviting Granton Hub to take part in this Curious Edinburgh walking tour programme. My name is Gina Reddy, and I'm a member of the steering committee of Granton Hub. We are a community group, and we started up by running a series of cultural pop-up events, and that was back in 2015. After this, we became a SKIO, a charity, in 2016. We run a number of activities for the benefit of the local community. We organize painting classes, we have craft sessions, we do upcycling and recycling activities, we have art exhibitions, we have a thriving community garden, and we're also opening a cafe shortly. However, we also have an extensive archive that is relating to the history of Granton, and it is some of this information that we would like to incorporate into a Curious Edinburgh walking tour. For those of you who are not familiar with Edinburgh, here we are. If you look on the Google map, you see that Medelvik House is close to Granton Harbour. We are in between Newhaven and Cramond, which is just about half an hour walk away along the promenade and the foreshore. If you were to do our walking tour, these are some of the sites that you would be enjoying. In Granton Harbour and across to the foreshore, you will get gorgeous views from Cramond Island and also from Fife. You will be able to see the Granton Gasworks in Victorian times on the left there. There is lots of green space and there are parks. However, there are also derelict areas where once industry stood, and these spaces are now waiting development. What we would like to incorporate in some of the tour stops is the history of Granton, of course. And just to give you a quick overview, we have the harbour, which has, of course, in the past had fishing fleets, whaling fleets. There were ferries, and there was even a train ferry to Fife. There was oil and petroleum companies, there was engineering companies, there was a foundry. There was a company that supplied inks and oils for the printing industry. There is imports of esparto grass, which was used for the paper mills. There was an ice factory, there was intricate railway network, there was even a tram. There is the Victorian gasworks, like I said earlier on, and there is the Granton quarry. Stone for that was used for all sorts of construction in Edinburgh. It's mentioned in some of the literature it was used for Holyrood Palace. I'm not sure if that's true, but it was used for the statue of Nelson on Nelson's column in London. As I said, lots of this has disappeared, and we would like to point out through the tour all the remnants of the past and what it means to the older folk in Granton who have perhaps worked in these industries, but also to all the new people who are currently moving in through all the new developments that are going on. So this list is not complete, but we're hoping to pick some of the stops for the tour in the future. However, Niki has asked me to illustrate one stop, and the one that I have picked is this one, is the Medelvik car factory, and you can see it just on the left there. This is Granton Hub, which is the original Medelvik house, and the car factory is next door. However, before I tell you something about the Medelvik car factory, I'll explain about the Medelvik Motor Carriage Company. This one was founded by William Pegg, later he became Sir William Pegg, and he was the Edinburgh City astronomer and an inventor. He was the director of the Edinburgh City Observatory from 1889 until his death. In 1889, he was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was an inventor, and he invented telescopes. One of them can still be seen at the Stirling Highland Hotel. However, what we're going to talk about here is, of course, the Medelvik car factory. This was built, completed rather, in 1899 at a cost of £33,000. The factory was reputed to be the very first purpose-built factory in Britain, with an office block next door, which is Medelvik House, the one that we are currently occupying. It had a test track. Some references are that this test track was supposed to be on the roof of the factory. I'm not entirely sure. But what I do know is that the factory was used for assembling electric cars. Now, you heard it right. This is electric cars in 1899. Now, William Pegg had quite a vision. And this is the vision that he wanted to establish. It was very ambitious, of course. He had a catalogue, and the Granton Hub have recently managed to obtain a copy of the catalogue. I've got a digitized copy here, and I've used some of the images for this tour and for this talk as well. However, back to the car. The Medelvik electric car was a vehicle driven by a fifth wheel that was fitted between the two front wheels. And now I'll read something out of the original, the auctioneer's description of the brochure. The vehicle was driven by a three-wheeled front axle unit comprising of a motor, batteries, and a small central wheel set behind the axle, which propelled the vehicle. The unit was mounted to the front of a chassis, creating a five-wheeled automobile, but could also be attached to any horse-drawn carriage. The reverse was also true, because if the batteries run out, they could just take it off and put a horse in front. This fifth wheel was such an iconic design that William Pegg actually had it incorporated into the building. And you see it on the right there at the top, where you have this circular design of the fifth wheel. However, to make a business viable, he had to negotiate various deals, and one of the deals he had was with the post office in 1899 to carry the mail between Leith and Edinburgh, 500 kilos of it. Of course, it's slightly uphill as well, which must have been quite a challenge, especially, for running on batteries, basically. However, the public didn't really like his idea, and by April 1900, the company was already in trouble. What I've done here is I've listed some of the companies that occupied Medelvik Car Factory, and as you can see, 6 different companies, all relating to making cars, buses, chassis, lorries, even taxi cabs. However, all of them failed. So what happened to the building? Well, in the First World War, the factory was used as a depot for torpedoes. However, in 1925, things slightly changed, and we have a company which was actually a consortium of different companies. Some of them were based in Granton, there were some in Leith, and I think the original ones were even from Glasgow. They decided to move into the premises, into the factory, to start manufacturing industrial wire cloth and non-ferrous wire. Now, today, that company is still there. They've actually moved across the road. You see that white space across the road. That's actually the purpose-built factory of United Wire, and they have been manufacturing in Granton for the past 175 years. However, what about the factory today, the original factory next door to Granton Hub? This is how it looks like today. Unfortunately, quite a derelict state. It's had various owners in the past. It was part of the original, well, the site at the National Galleries of Scotland, who at the back were developing a repository. They had some ideas of what to do with the factory. Unfortunately, it didn't materialise, and they returned the ownership back to the Scottish Government, who then recently, in March, have turned ownership to Edinburgh Council. Of course, at Granton Hub, we are very keen to find out what the plans are of Edinburgh Council, and we hope that as a community hub, we will have some involvement in realising their plans. That was my illustration of that one stop. What I would like to say, though, is that, as I mentioned recently, or just now, we do have the original, the original catalogue that we purchased through an auction, and we managed to digitize that copy. Some of the images I've used in this talk, but we do have the catalogue for sale, and if anyone is interested, please get in touch after the talk. Thank you very much.
Curious Edinburgh is such a wonderful app, and it's for me also been such a wonderful adventure through getting to Edinburgh and kind of getting to know a different side of the city. And we kind of hope that this is also what you get out of today. And if you are able to explore a bit further, to see all these buildings and places that have connections to the history of science, technology and medicine, and also that is not only showing that, but also showing a little bit the people behind these buildings that once lived in these buildings, and also the social networks that have been important, the international connections. So how science is also very much a social endeavor, and how it's also an international endeavor. And we are hoping that by looking a little bit through this app and by walking through Edinburgh, you will see the houses there and the places with different eyes, and not only seeing what it is now, but also seeing a little bit behind that. At least that's what it did for me. And finally, I would want to say that this, again, is a collaborative effort, and there have been many more people involved and also many more organizations. We've also been relying on quite a lot of different types of funding. You can all find these funding sources on the app in the About page. Also, after making the app, we were really overwhelmed with the amount of attention that we were getting. So we went to the internet to the Science Festival already last year. We've participated in the Edinburgh International Festival, and they were talking about Hutton. So there were many occasions that we were able to take part in. So we could tell you much more about that, but unfortunately the time is up. So I would like to thank you for today, and then I'll give the floor back to Leslie. And I think, if any questions, we're obviously very happy to answer them and to tell a little bit more about what happened with the app.
We're actually going to hand over the Dalyell Prize. So Niki, it gives me very great pleasure on behalf of the prize committee, because I'm one of the judges of this prize, to hand this to you in recognition of this wonderful work, bringing Edinburgh to life. Absolutely wonderful, and a really very entertaining evening that we've had today. So can I say on behalf of the prize judges, the prize for you.
Thank you very much.
It's a bit like the Oscars, so Niki's now going to give a vote of thanks.
You can open it, and then in the meantime, I'll say a word of thanks. Is that okay?
Okay, thanks.
No, so as I said, it is very much a collective effort, and obviously we're very happy with the prize. But as with the Nobel Prize, that is mostly given to one person or to maybe 3 persons now. That's not really in line with how science is working these days or how research is working. And I'm studying collaboration, and I think this is also very much a collaborative effort. So the prize is a collaborative prize as well. So Bill, you can open it and then we'll see what is actually in there. We're very grateful for the prize. And I've never had the opportunity to meet Dalyell, which is a shame, because what I've read about him is that he was a very remarkable person, standing for his cause and being also very outspoken, which as a Dutch person I always appreciate. But he also had a heart for science, and that's why we have this prize here. In his biography, he writes that both he and his wives were, of course, socialists, but also very much believed in cooperation. And that's a message that today is still very relevant. And we also hope that our work is showing that importance of collaboration, not only in the university, also in the city, but also internationally. There is a prize, and I think Bill can actually show what it is now. So maybe you are also curious what was in the... So this is it. We can... that's wonderful. So I think we'll have to find a place for that. So there's also a little bit of money that is given with this prize. And so we thought that this would be good to donate that to making actually the Granton Hub tour a reality. It's proven a little bit difficult to find the funding for that. And because it is such a wonderful tour that indeed would kind of open up Curious Edinburgh, taking it outside of the center and also showing the industrial heritage, we thought that's a good way to actually spend that money. So hopefully the Granton tour live very soon as well. So of course, thanks also for the jury and for all our funders and all our collaborators. And I think, it would be nice to have a drink now.
I'm the only person standing between you and the drink, so it's my very pleasant duty to bring this evening's proceedings to a close. Dr. Johnson once said, "Whatever places the past or the future above the present holds the key to human flourishing." And things like Curious Edinburgh, and particularly the work of the Granton Hub too, is all about human flourishing. So thank you very much for sharing this with us this evening. Just some final thanks to Niki and her team. Thanks very much to the organisers, and thank you all for coming along. This is a really well-attended event, and it's lovely to see you all here on this beautiful spring evening in Edinburgh at last, spring at last. So all I can say is there's drink at the back of the hall, drink, be merry, and above all, stay curious. Thank you and good night.